Mitchell, Executive Director for Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area, and welcome to our program tonight on the International Underground Railroad Month that we're celebrating here in Freedom's Frontier in both the states of Kansas and Missouri. We're emphasizing the sites that are on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, a program run by the National Park Service. And I'm thrilled that we're going to be able to focus tonight on the Watkins Museum of History in Lawrence. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Tonight you'll have an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. Now you can add your questions as we go in the question and answer area of the Zoom app. Just type your question there and we'll have them prepared and I'll be happy to ask them for you. Now, if you'd like to ask your question with your own voice and camera, you can do both by raising your hand. I'll call on you and turn on both your camera and your audio so that you may interact with our participants tonight. So we're excited to have you here and excited that you're going to be a part of this effort as we go through tonight. Now, as we start out, I wanted to share with you the mission of Freedom's Frontiers to tell the stories of the struggles for freedom in our region and their lasting impact on our nation. Now, the nationally significant stories we tell are the Kansas-Missouri border war, the settling of the frontier, and the enduring struggle for freedom. Now, we have 41 counties that make up Freedom's Frontier. 29 of them are in Kansas, 12 of them in Missouri. Now, you can find those locations on our Freedom's Frontier map, or as part of our special project for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, we've started a tour as part of our app to share with you. So to get us started, I want to share a little bit about that app.
Sometimes the most important stories aren't widely told. Sometimes what matters the most remains a secret, even if it's right in front of us. There's a place that defined the history of our nation, where patriots fighting for freedom gained victories that lasted through the years to secure equal freedoms for all Americans. We're talking about the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. If you didn't know you had such a place around you, the FFNHA app is for you. You'll discover important historic sites and museums, all connected to tell the remarkable stories that shaped our nation. The settlement of the frontier, the border war and civil war, and the enduring struggle for freedom. Thanks to our easy-to-use app, you'll find tours and amazing places to visit that bring the region together and make it come alive. Visit the App Store or the Google Play Store. Download the FFNHA app and discover the stories that changed a nation. Enjoy the ride. History awaits.
So the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom is on the front page of the Freedom's Frontier app. And you'll be able to click on that link to get a variety of pieces of information, including turn-by-turn directions to each of the sites. You'll also have the opportunity, and we know this is important to many people who have been over the years collecting the NPS passport stamps. We have digital passport stamps provided by the National Park Service that when you visit sites, you'll receive those digital passport stamps in the app. You have an opportunity to collect all of the ones that are visible here in Freedom's Frontier. And this gives you an example of what one of those digital stamps looks like. You can download the app from either the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. So let me begin with tonight's program by starting out and sharing with you a little bit about the topic at hand, and that is the Watkins Museum of History. And I'm pleased to welcome to our program the Executive Director of the Watkins Museum of History, Steve Nowak. Steve has long been committed to telling the stories of Freedom's Frontier. He heads up the Freedom's Frontier Partner Advisory Group. And Steve, it's great to have you with us here today, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and welcome to the Watkins Museum. The video that you just saw gives a little taste of what the Watkins Museum is like, especially for those of you who haven't visited us. But the Watkins Museum is not the scene of any Underground Railroad activity, at least any activity that we know of. Our building was built in 1888 by a man named J.B. Watkins, and it housed his land mortgage company and the Watkins National Bank. In the late 1850s, our building was just a few blocks outside the main business district in Lawrence, and actually on one of the main routes into town. It was quite a busy location, and was probably not the kind of location where you would want to undertake any activities that needed to be kept secret. It was a rather prominent location. So we connect with the Underground Railroad in a variety of ways, but we aren't an actual site. Sorry. There are always a few technical. Here we are. Always a few technical adjustments before we get started. The contribution that the Watkins makes to the National Underground Network to Freedom, and we're very pleased that we're a part of that listing. Our contribution is really through the exhibits that we offer. And tonight we will offer you a tour of those exhibits. The exhibits that we have on view set the scene for the Underground Railroad in Lawrence and Douglas County. They describe the events of Bleeding Kansas, and they serve as a gateway to the Underground Railroad sites in Douglas County, introducing the stories that happened across the region. And they also set the happenings in Douglas County and in Lawrence in the broader national context of the enduring struggle for freedom. Our exhibits begin with John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist of national repute who was active in Kansas Territory in the late 1850s. Lots of people have heard of him. Brown was a participant in the Wakarusa War, which was a relatively bloodless event in Bleeding, Kansas. He participated in that shortly after he arrived in Kansas Territory. This event happened in December 1855, just a few months after he arrived. And in 1856, in retaliation for the sack of Lawrence, which happened that May, John Brown brutally killed 5 pro-slavery settlers in an episode that's now known as the Potawatomi Massacre. This action made him a target of pro-slavery forces in the Battle of Blackjack, which happened in Douglas County in the southeast corner near Baldwin City. Brown left Kansas in 1859 as actually part of an Underground Railroad story that we'll learn more about at a later time. He left in 1859 escorting a group of 12 freedom seekers north to freedom in Canada. Lawrence was founded by the New England Immigrant Aid Company, which was headquartered in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was home to a very strong abolitionist movement, and those abolitionist sentiments came west with those parties of settlers sponsored by the New England Immigrant Aid Company. Douglas County was home to a number of abolitionist settlers, including Captain John E. Stewart, Joel and Emily Grover, and the Miller family. One of the nation's best documented Underground Railroad episodes, and an episode that involved John Brown, took place in the Grover's Stone Barn in January 1859. I would provide more detail, but I don't want to spoil the story of another program that's going to be offered as part of this series by the Guardians of Grover Barn. But there's a very interesting story about an entire documented journey from Vernon and Bates County, Missouri, all the way to Freedom in Windsor, Canada, that is told with the Grover Barn as the centerpiece. It may be a structure that you know, but might not recognize from the historic photo we have here. It was converted in the 1980s into a fire station and stands on Lawrence Avenue, just slightly south of Clinton Parkway. The Miller family, and their home is shown here. They factored prominently in the Underground Railroad. Their smokehouse was used as a station. And the family themselves came from South Carolina, where, as being abolitionists in South Carolina, they were somewhat persecuted and moved to Kansas in order to do their part to stop the spread of slavery. Douglas County has stories of freedom seekers as well. During the Civil War, Lawrence was a haven for former slaves who were seeking freedom. George Washington, held as a slave in Platte County, Missouri, escaped across the frozen Missouri River to Quindaro in 1862 and eventually made his way to Leavenworth. He enlisted in the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry Regiment. And after his military service, he established a farm near Bloomington, which is now Clinton Lake. The 1880s and 1890s were a time of community building for African Americans living in Lawrence. During these years, churches, clubs, benevolent societies, and schools were founded. African Americans in Douglas County worked as laborers in Lawrence or Eudora. They established farms in the Wakarusa River Valley near Bloomington. Black businesses were founded and located primarily in the 700 and 800 blocks of Vermont Street in Lawrence. But at this time, African Americans made up nearly 25% of the population in Lawrence. But in the early 1900s, even the home of the Free State movement was not immune to the attitudes of Jim Crow America. Langston Hughes, the grandson of abolitionists, was raised by his grandmother in Lawrence. His experiences of discrimination and injustice while growing up here served to inspire his later writings. The Watkins Museum examines not just these stories I shared with you right now, but it examines the whole picture of the challenges of the Jim Crow era as they manifested themselves in Lawrence, and in efforts in the community to break down what were considered norms of discrimination in that 100-year period that followed the end of the Reconstruction period right through to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Before we continue our tour of this enduring struggle for freedom, I'd like to introduce Will Hickox.
Hi, everybody.
Will is the public engagement coordinator at the Watkins Museum, and he was also the project director for an interactive exhibit at the museum that brings the struggles for freedom in Lawrence and Douglas County's heritage of activism up to more recent times. So I will turn the tour over to you.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I say thank you and lead on.
Thank you, I will. Yeah, I'm public engagement coordinator here at the Watkins, and I'd like you all to join me on a very short little walk through the rest of our second floor gallery as I continue the stories of the struggles for freedom in Douglas County and especially Lawrence, where Steve left off. And we'll see how these struggles for racial equality and other freedoms, they went on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and throughout the 20th century. And in many cases, they were inspired by Lawrence's earlier history and also by the students and folks at KU as well, and at Haskell Indian Nations University. So here on our second floor, hopefully you can see that, yeah. So one of the little known stories of Lawrence is the story of Haskell Institute, which is known today as Haskell Indian Nations University. This began in the 1880s as what was called an industrial school for a Native American youth. And unfortunately, they were treated very badly, and many of them died. And many of those early students are still buried on the campus. It evolved into a much different institution, and it's still going strong today as Haskell Indian Nations University. But it has a very interesting and in some cases a tragic early history. So we also document stories of Jim Crow and the post-Reconstruction era, so from the 1870s into the early 1900s. This is often known as the Jim Crow era, when the country experienced very severe segregation and discrimination, particularly against African Americans. And although Lawrence had this early reputation as a bastion of freedom, it was not an equal place by any means, and segregation continued in schools and public facilities for many years into the 20th century. So you can see here, I'm sort of awkwardly guiding us along here. By the time you get to World War II, participation in that conflict inspired a very vigorous civil rights movement. You know, the nation was fighting for tolerance and equality across the globe, and that inspired another struggle here at home for equality. And you can see here how, well, certainly if you visit the museum or you see our materials online, you'll get the story of how KU really emerged as a center point locally for activism on topics like African American civil rights. And there were a couple of key organizations that formed, including a local branch of the Congress of Racial Equality and the Lawrence League for the Practice of Democracy. And you can see on our wall here a reproduction of a membership card for that organization. Both of these groups fought against segregation, and they fought for equal rights for all Americans in the area. For instance, one particularly noteworthy, certainly at the time, noteworthy example of segregation was swimming facilities. There was a popular pool in downtown called the Jayhawk Plunge that was segregated and did not allow African Americans to swim. There was a protest movement that began in 1960 to desegregate the pool. And that movement failed. The pool eventually closed down, but in 1967, the folks of Lawrence voted to fund a municipal pool, and that would be free to any swimmers. And that opened in the late 60s. And it was open to swimmers of all colors. Another noteworthy campaign that happened, it's particularly significant here at the Watkins building, is something that you can see here. That may be reversed for in your image there, but so there was very severe discrimination in housing here in town, and a group of Lawrence citizens organized a movement that was actually led by local churches to outlaw racial discrimination in housing. And eventually, after a long campaign, they got an ordinance passed at the city level in 1967. And that ordinance was signed right here in the Watkins building, which was City Hall at the time. So that's a sort of a proud moment for our own history here at the Watkins building, but also a noteworthy event in Lawrence history. And a pretty well-known story is how Wilt Chamberlain came to KU in the previous decade, the 1950s. And he was not interested at all in participating in segregation. He made a point of visiting establishments where blacks were typically barred from entering, and nobody was going to turn him away because he was, you know, the famous Big Dipper, the star of the basketball team at KU. And eventually, some of the KU officials banded with Chamberlain and other athletes, and they succeeded in getting segregation overturned, or at least partly overturned, in Lawrence. And going into the 60s, of course, we all know this was a time of a lot of agitation and radicalism that was centered on campuses in many cases, as folks continued to protest racial discrimination, but also began to protest the Vietnam War and discrimination against women and other causes as well. So there were a lot of sit-ins at the University of Kansas and the Chancellor's office, places like that. Now, by the late 60s, things got a little more bitter and violent. In fact, quite a bit more. And by 1970, there was a pretty severe social and political divide here in town. And in the spring of that year, tensions erupted, as you can see in this, the corner of our second floor permanent gallery here, when there were several dozen arson and bombing attacks throughout the town. And the townspeople tended to blame the students at KU, but in fact, many of these incidents were not solved. But certainly there was a lot of tension over the Vietnam War, over a large population of counterculture folks, often known as hippies, over discrimination against African Americans and the rise of the Black Power movement. And then there was just the conservative backlash against all these things, and it really exploded in 1970, particularly later in May after the United States invaded Cambodia, and there were 4 students killed at Kent State. There were 2 young men, both 19 years old, killed by police in July of 1970. These are incidents that have really, they caused a wound that most people, I think, would say hasn't ever healed here in Lawrence. But, out of this whole era of activism and violence in many cases, some good things did emerge. The city organized a series of public conversations in which people got together and discussed the issues that were tearing people apart in Lawrence. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to a video which talks about our Enduring Struggles Interactive. And then I can talk a little bit more about that while the video plays, and then talk about membership at the Watkins. All right, so this interactive was finished in 20. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me. R-E-S-P-E-C-T, take F-T-C-T. Thank you, Aretha. So every era has a different sound clip, which really gets into the spirit of the times and all the different protest movements that happened. And it goes from the 60s right into the 2010s. And it includes audio, imagery, some video clips, and on the sides are a few artifacts as well that really get you into the feel of, going through a scrapbook or some other kind of archival material that digs into the history of our county and especially Lawrence. So this interactive Enduring Struggles is something that you can see here at the Watkins for free. Now with that, I just want to mention that none of the things that we do here, preserving the history of this area, could be accomplished without our members and without our donors. And there are several different ways that you can become a member of the Watkins Museum. There are many different levels of membership and donation. I encourage you to go to watkinsmuseum.org and you can learn all about those membership opportunities. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Will. And I'm going to take just a moment and add Steve to our presentation as well, and remind everyone that Will and Steve are available for questions. You've got 2 ways to ask your questions right now. You can either put them in the question and answer section of the app here, or you can raise your hand. And I'd like to get us started. The rich history of the Underground Railroad in Douglas County is really only partially preserved, isn't it? There are a number of other sites. I know I spent a considerable amount of time on the phone today with Judy Sweets talking about this issue. And there are scores of sites that haven't yet been memorialized and certainly raised to the level of the Network for Freedom. Is that a role you think that this community can embrace?
How about if I go first? Well, we're kind of looking at each other. I'm down, just so that you know, I'm downstairs on the ground floor and Will is upstairs 1 floor above me. So while we're used to having more direct contact, we're kind of keeping an eye on each other through these videos. Yes, I think so. And we've seen the way the community really expresses an interest in this part of our heritage when issues around the Grover Barn come up, which is, as I had mentioned before, it now stands as a city property that had been modified into a fire station. But when the story of that building is told, a lot of people express interest in it. There is interest in seeing the site. A number of the sites that we have here in Douglas County are on private property, so they're not especially accessible. But those stories are well known, thanks to people like Judy Sweets, who is an Underground Railroad scholar here locally. And I think that as we come up with occasions to celebrate that history and tell more of those stories, people find that that's an era that they want to engage in, because it in some ways resonates with where we are now, where people felt like in order to make a change, they had to undertake, they had to make a strong statement with the actions that they took. And that was certainly the case with the abolitionists. And Will probably has something to add.
No, well said, Steve. But I would just like, I mean, I'll just add that I've lived in a lot of different communities, and Lawrence has more community spirit than any place I've lived in. And it has more of a sense, or the residents, I should say, have more of a sense of their town's history than any place I've lived in. And just speaking with folks, not even in the museum, but just offhand, often it seems like people are aware that we have a history of being founded as a community that prizes freedom and equality for everyone. And while, that doesn't, there are struggles against that notion as well, and against certain groups. Overall, I think, the history of the Underground Railroad as something that brought people to this area goes beyond those relatively few sites that we've identified here in town. Mm-hmm. And just the Watkins is a place where people can come to learn more of that history of that whole era and that movement, just like they can at several other Freedom's Frontier sites.
And the county is lucky in that a number of sites that connect with the Underground Railroad that are further outside town are preserved and are accessible to the public. I'm thinking especially of Clinton Lake, which also has a really rich underground Underground Railroad history that is explained at the Wakarusa River Valley Heritage Museum.
Excellent. I would remind everyone that has joined us as a participant in this, that if you'd like to ask a question, you can put it in the question and answer section of the Zoom app, or you can use the device that allows you to raise your hand, and then I can add you to the conversation and you can ask your question directly. Well, as part of what you showed us, you told briefly the story of Wilt Chamberlain and his activism. And for many people, as I watched the discussion about today's activism of professional athletes, whether it be basketball, hockey, football, baseball, talk about unprecedented participation in social commentary. Yet Chamberlain really was a pioneer at the college level, was he not?
Yes, he was. And it just goes to show you that, the current events of today don't happen in a vacuum, and they draw upon the history of our society and our nation and locally as well. And Lawrence and the Watkins Museum are places where people can go to, learn stories like Wilt Chamberlain at KU. So yeah, everything that we're experiencing today has a history, and we can't promise to give you all the answers for determining where you stand on any particular issue, but you can at least get a decent grounding in the local history of these issues by coming here to KU.
Mm-hmm. And Wilt Chamberlain wasn't
down the hill to the Watkins. I did a plug for KU there, so hopefully
there you go. That's good. We can plug them a little bit. They're good neighbors. But Wilt Chamberlain wasn't the only KU athlete that, or I should say athlete activist that made a difference. In the 1930s, there was a student enrolled in the physical education program. His name was an African-American student. His name was John McClendon. He went on to become the first professional basketball coach in the black basketball coach in the NBA. But while he was a student, the university's policy was that all of the phys ed students had to pass a swimming test. But they waived that requirement for African-American students because African-American students were only allowed to swim in the swimming pool on the last day of the month before they drained it. And John McClendon worked with other fellow students to make an agreement with the university because he felt if he was going to be a phys ed teacher, he needed to pass the same tests that all of the white students did. And he made an arrangement with the university administration and his fellow students that if the university integrated the pool and for 2 weeks there were no racial incidents, it would become policy. And he was able to pull that off. And from that point forward, African-American students had the same access to facilities there and were treated on equal footing with the white students in the phys ed program.
A fascinating story. Thank you, Steve. One final question I have for you. What's next for the Watkins Museum of History?
Do you want me to field that one, Steve?
Yeah, I'll do what's next, but a little further down the road.
Sounds good. So we, of course, are always excited to partner with Freedom's Frontier and Jim. And on September 25th, we are doing another video in our series, Portals to the Past, which presents real historical individuals who are significant to the history of the border region, doing an interview with me about their lives. And they are personified or portrayed, I should say, by reenactors and actors in the local area. So on September 25th, we have the next event in this series, and it's an interview with Amelia Earhart, who of course was a pioneering female aviator. And she will be portrayed by Amanda Hamilton Burkhart, who is the lead educator at the Watkins, the education liaison for Freedom's Frontier, and an educator and actor. So we're very excited for that. We have over 70 people registered for that, but I believe you still have time to register. You can find that event on Facebook and on the Watkins website. It's free. It's at 10 a.m. on Friday, September 25th.
And I'm going to look a little bit further out, and maybe not with specifics, but just with some information, because often people think about what museums do and what we present, but not how we do them. And the current pandemic and the COVID-19 public health crisis has really challenged us in the way we do things, which was always bring people into the museum and put them in a relatively enclosed space. So we have been looking for new ways to engage the public. We've brought some of our exhibits outdoors. We have one right now along 11th Street that talks about Massachusetts Street and its role in public protest. Something that resonates with things we've seen happen in cities across the country. Similar things have happened in Lawrence's past as well. I certainly need to thank Jim Ogle, who provides the technical capabilities for all of the online programming that we do. Will mentioned the successful Portals to the Past, which is a great partnership between the two organizations, helping us kind of bring the content that we are stewards of out to the public in a new form without us having to learn a whole bunch of new technical stuff or have to serve as good a stage manager as Jim is. And we continue with exhibits, even though we don't open them in the same way that we did with the big public program. We do continue to maintain our schedule of changing exhibits. The museum is open to the public from 10 to 4 on Tuesday through Saturdays. And while we ask people to leave their contact information at the door, There really are no restrictions on visiting. We ask that people wear a mask, but they're able to move through the building and see the exhibits. And we're in the process of changing things out like we always do in the fall. And the next exhibit to come is going to be called Training Wheels, which is about the history of toys in Lawrence, and looks very much at toys as a medium that were used to reinforce gender roles, but also to help kids come to grips with the world that they lived in, which is maybe something children have to do right now too. So we like when we can make a connection to what happened in the past and things we're going through now. So those exhibits will continue to change, and we are also continuing to develop our third floor core exhibit with some wonderful grant support, both from federal and private foundations, and great support from private individuals. We are closing in on finishing what will end up being a 10-year-long project, and we'll be finishing the third floor with a range of exhibits that explore different themes that describe how Lawrence became the way Lawrence is, things that are sort of foundational in our past, like our belief in the power of education and our value of the spirit of activism and our entrepreneurial spirit, and of course our love of sports and the KU-MU rivalry. So we have some great things to look forward to into 2021 here at the Watkins Museum.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to both you and Will for your kind comments. I do appreciate it. I do have a question from Liz Leach, and I'm not certain which of you might be best to answer this. Liz asks that I have an Underground Railroad question about the Watkins and how it shares and conveys stories of the many people involved in Lawrence and Douglas County in the Underground Railroad. Aside from the main John Doy story and the John Brown Battle of the Spurs event, do you have a collection of researched and published stories to read at the museum? Do you have some suggestions for further readings?
Our research room, run by research coordinator Monica Davis, is a great place to start that kind of search. In addition to published materials, we also keep clippings files, things that are related around certain topics, and the Underground Railroad and the people in Douglas County who were involved in it are one of those topics that's that is explored there. It's possible to make an appointment in the research room, simply emailing research@watkinsmuseum.org with a request for some information. That's really the best way to get that started and to get access to those kinds of resources that aren't generally on public view.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Steve, thank you very much for your participation tonight, and you as well, Will. The reverse balancing of a computer in order to show us pictures of the Watkins, you handled it quite well. Thank you very much.
I cheated and used still images. I'm not as coordinated as well.
Well, thank you both for your participation tonight. And thank you all for joining us as well. We very much appreciate your participation in this focus on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom and the various sites. We have a number of other sites for which we'll be doing programs during the month of September. As mentioned earlier, you can find out about those on the Freedom's Frontier Facebook pages, and the Watkins Facebook page also shares that information as well. We so appreciate you being a part of tonight's program, and we thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks. Good night.